Beware of the empath with no friends. When you see them alone, you see a victim. You think they're fragile. You think they've collapsed. But you're wrong. They didn't shatter. They woke up. Carl Jung revealed that true power doesn't seek popularity. It seeks silence. The empath loner hasn't run away from life. They've simply stopped feeding the chaos. They aren't practicing avoidance. They are practicing sovereignty. And that is what makes them dangerous, because the version you think you're dealing with no longer exists. You can no longer read them. You can no longer manipulate them. Their empathy is no longer a gift you can take. It's a mirror you'll fear to look into. In this video, we uncover why the isolated empath is not the weakest person in the room, but the most formidable soul you will ever misjudge. It all began as a silent rescue mission. Their solitude was never an accident. It was the only way to keep the self from disappearing. The empath loner did not arrive at solitude by accident. There is a prevailing myth that people who isolate themselves are simply antisocial, awkward, or incapable of connecting. This is a superficial reading of a deep biological and psychological mechanism. No human being with a nervous system tuned to the frequency of connection simply chooses isolation without a profound structural cause. Science calls this a sensory overload, but spiritualists call it an energetic debt. And the empath is not isolating to hide. They are isolating to pay it back. This state is not a personality quirk. It is a result of saturation. Their solitude begins to make sense once you look at how the empathic nervous system actually works. Carl Jung described the psyche as a self-regulating system, much like the physical body. When the body is subjected to extreme heat, it sweats to cool down. This is not a choice. It is a biological compensation. When the psyche is subjected to extreme emotional input for decades, it eventually triggers a shutdown mechanism to prevent total collapse. The solitude you see is that shutdown mechanism in action. For the majority of their life, this person likely lived without a psychological filter. They lived with the psychic pores of their mind wide open. In a room full of people, you might hear the conversation, but the empath feels the subtext. They register the tension in a jawline, the tremor in a voice, the unspoken grievance between two friends standing in the corner. They do not just observe these data points, they metabolize them. Their internal system runs a constant, invisible marathon of emotional processing. Jung spoke of participation mystique, a primitive state of unconscious identity with others where the subject cannot distinguish themselves from the object. The empath lived in a modern version of this state. They were constantly merging, constantly feeling, constantly carrying. But a system cannot run at maximum capacity forever without burning out the motor. Most people have experienced walking into a crowded room and sensing a heavy atmosphere before a word is spoken. Most people can shake that off in 5 minutes. The empath carries it for 5 days. They were the ones who stayed on the phone for 3 hours, listening to a friend loop through the same crisis, not because they wanted to, but because they physically felt the friend's anxiety and needed to resolve it to feel peace themselves. This immersion was total. Before the withdrawal, there was not an absence of connection, there was an excess of it. They were saturated. The withdrawal you witness now is the psyche's emergency brake. It is a correction. The unconscious mind, which always seeks balance, realized that the individual was in danger of dissolving completely into the demands of the collective. To save the self, it forced a retreat. This is why the solitude feels so solid to them. It is not a preference they can switch off on a Saturday night. It is a structural necessity for their survival. This is the point where most people misread them completely. You might look at them and see someone who is avoiding life. You might think they are depressed. But from the perspective of their internal reality, they are finally preserving life. They have reached a point of saturation where one more drop of uninvited emotion would cause the vessel to overflow. They are not antisocial. They are simply full. The warning here, the beware, lies in your assumption that they are lonely and waiting to be rescued. You assume that because you fear solitude, they must fear it too. But you are projecting your own extroverted needs onto a psyche that has shifted its axis. They have turned the flow of their libido, their psychic energy, inward. Jung called this introversion in its truest sense. It is not shyness, it is the reclamation of energy that was being hemorrhaged into the environment. When you approach them with the intent to bring them out of their shell, you are acting on a fundamental misunderstanding. You are trying to drag them back into the very noise that nearly destroyed them. You are offering them connection, but to them, it looks like contamination. They have spent years building a wall not to keep people out, but to keep their own sanity in. This withdrawal is the only way they could survive their own sensitivity. They learned the hard way that their empathy was a vulnerability before it was a gift. Without the boundary of solitude, they would have been consumed by the unconscious demands of those around them. So, they built the boundary. If you are ready to stop mistaking solitude for weakness, make sure to subscribe to Zero Mind. We are building a library of insights for those stepping out of false connection and back into psychological sovereignty. In the next part, we move deeper into what this survival cost them and how years of giving without limits quietly emptied them long before the silence began. The history of the empath loner is a history of theft. Not that things were stolen from them maliciously, but that they gave pieces of themselves away until there was nothing left to trade. This giving was rarely a conscious choice. It was a compulsion born from early conditioning and a misunderstanding of their own value. In many cases, the empath child was the emotional regulator of their environment. This detail explains more than it first appears. A family or a social group is a system, and systems seek stability. If parents are emotionally immature or chaotic, the sensitive child unconsciously steps in to stabilize the system. They become the good one, the easy one, the listener. Jung argued that the persona, the mask we wear for society, is often formed to buy safety and belonging. For the empath, the persona was one of extreme availability. They learned early on that their worth was tied to their utility. If they could soothe a parent's rage, they were safe. If they could listen to a friend's crisis, they were valued. If they could absorb the anger of a partner, they were loved. They became the unspoken mediators of every social group they entered. They were the designated healers, the unpaid therapists, the keepers of secrets. When a conflict arose at work, they were the ones people vented to. When a relationship in their friend group crumbled, they were the ones supporting both sides. This role creates a devastating economic imbalance in the psyche. The empath pours energy out, but very little flows back in. They become a limitless resource for others, a well that everyone drinks from, but no one replenishes. Over decades, this creates a psychic deficit. You can see this pattern in their past behavior. They would say yes to a favor when every cell in their body wanted to say no, because the discomfort of the other person felt more urgent than their own fatigue. They would allow people to dump hours of negative emotional content onto them, believing that listening was their moral duty. Remember the physical heaviness in your chest when the phone rang? That wasn't just annoyance. That was your nervous system screaming, "Danger!" They allowed their boundaries to be eroded because they believed that boundaries were barriers to love. But the psyche keeps a ledger. The unconscious is a strict accountant. Every time they suppressed their own needs to accommodate another, a debt was recorded. Every time they swallowed their anger to keep the peace, the pressure built up in the shadow. They gave away their time, their attention, and their life force, believing that this was what it meant to be a good person. Eventually, the bank runs dry. The day comes when the empath wakes up and realizes they are bankrupt. They have no more patience to lend. They have no more empathy to offer. The mechanism of giving simply breaks. This is often the moment they disappear from social circles. The people around them are often confused or offended. They ask, "What happened? You changed. You used to be so nice." They feel betrayed because the utility they relied on has been removed. But the empath hasn't turned against them. The empath has simply stopped functioning as a utility. Jung warned that if we identify too closely with the persona, we lose contact with the self. The empath loner is someone who has been forced to strip off the persona of the helper because it became too heavy to carry. They realized that their goodness was actually a form of self-destruction. When they withdraw, they are not punishing the world. They are engaging in a desperate act of resource recovery. They are calling back all the energy they sent out. They are closing the accounts. They are realizing that they spent their lives regulating the emotions of others while their own inner garden withered from neglect. Over time, this is what leads them to keep no friends. The old friendships were likely built on the premise of their unlimited availability. Those relationships cannot survive the new reality of their limits. The empath looks at their phone and sees demands, not connections. They see people who want something, need something, or expect something, and the answer to all of it is silence. They have learned that in the economy of their past relationships, they were the product, not the partner. To keep those friends would mean returning to the role of the provider, and that is a role they can no longer afford to play. The cost of admission to their life has changed. It used to be free. Now, it requires a level of reciprocity that most people are unwilling or unable to pay. Beware of thinking you can pull them back into the old dynamic. Those who once gave endlessly no longer give by default. They have retired from the business of emotional management. I'm curious if this reflects your own experience. Have you ever noticed how giving slowly cost you more than you realized? If this resonates, comment the word drained below. That pattern didn't happen by accident. In the next part, we turn inward, toward the side of the empath that was never allowed to exist, but never stopped waiting. The empath loner is often misperceived as harmless. But what people fail to see is that this calm exterior is the result of a shadow that has already been integrated. This is a sentimental view that misses the psychological reality completely. The true transformation happens not because they are good, but because they have finally made contact with their badness. They have integrated their shadow. Jung used the word shadow to describe everything we tend to deny in ourselves. The dark, unlit corridors of the personality, the traits we consider unacceptable. For the nice empath, the shadow is not evil in the criminal sense. It is the capacity for aggression, for selfishness, for coldness, and for disagreeable behavior. For years, the empath repressed these qualities. They believed they were not allowed to be angry. They believed they were not allowed to put themselves first. They pushed these impulses down into the unconscious to maintain their self-image of being a loving, helpful person. They viewed their own aggression as a failure of character. But you cannot repress the shadow forever. As the exhaustion from years of overgiving mounted, the shadow began to leak through. The empath began to feel flashes of intense resentment toward the people they were helping. They began to feel a secret disgust for the neediness of others. They began to fantasize about walking away and never looking back. The breakthrough occurs when the empath stops fighting these feelings and accepts them. They realize that their resentment is not a sin, it is a signal. It is the psyche screaming that a violation has occurred. The anger is the energy of self-protection trying to reassert itself. When the empath loner integrates this shadow, they undergo a fundamental change. They are no longer harmless. A harmless person is incapable of hurting others. A peaceful person is capable of it, but chooses not to. The integrated empath is capable of cutting you off. They are capable of saying no without offering an apology or an explanation. They are capable of watching you struggle with your own mess without rushing in to save you. This integration of the shadow withdraws the libido or psychic energy from the social persona. They no longer invest energy in appearing nice. This makes them immune to the primary tools of social manipulation. Consider how manipulation works in most relationships. It relies on your need to be seen as a good person. If someone says, "I thought you cared about me," they are leveraging your fear of your own shadow. They are betting that you will do anything to avoid being seen as selfish or uncaring. But the integrated empath loner has already accepted their selfishness. They have accepted that they cannot save everyone. So when you say, "You're being selfish," they do not panic. They internally agree. They think, "Yes, I am prioritizing myself. That is true." When you say, "You've changed, you're so cold now," they do not rush to warm up. They acknowledge the coldness as a necessary boundary. This renders the emotional hooks useless. You cannot shame someone who has already accepted their own limitations. You cannot guilt-trip someone who has decided that their own survival is more important than your comfort. This is where they become dangerous to the wrong people, not because they attack, but because they no longer respond. Manipulators rely on reaction. Emotional dependents rely on access. The integrated empath offers neither. And when someone cannot access you, cannot move you, cannot provoke you, they are forced to confront their own powerlessness. This is a terrifying shift for those who are used to controlling the empath. The buttons that used to work, guilt, obligation, praise, the silent treatment, are now disconnected. The wires have been cut. The empath looks at you with a level, unbothered gaze, and you can feel that they are not seeking your approval. They are not afraid of your judgment. Jung taught that the integration of the shadow is the essential path to wholeness. The empath loner has become whole by reclaiming their capacity for refusal. They have taken back the power of the word no. This makes them formidable. They are no longer operating from a place of deficit, begging for love by being good. They are operating from a place of sovereignty. They know that they have a dark side, a side that prefers solitude, a side that judges, a side that rejects. And they use that dark side to protect their light. They use their coldness as a shield for their warmth. They keep no friends because most friendships require them to suppress the shadow. Most people want the compliant, easy version of the empath. They do not want the version that has boundaries. They do not want the version that speaks the truth even when it is uncomfortable. The empath knows this. They know that to have friends often means going back into the cage of niceness, and they would rather be alone in the dark than caged in the light. In the next part, we will turn the lens outward to see why this new internal state provokes such a strong, unsettling reaction in everyone they meet, and why you might feel disturbing emotions when you stand near them. The presence of an empath loner is often described as unsettling, intimidating, or disturbing by those who encounter them. People feel a strange discomfort in their vicinity, a sense that something is missing from the interaction. This discomfort is not caused by what the empath is doing. It is caused by what the empath is not doing. Most human interactions are unconscious treaties of mutual validation. When two people meet, they are usually engaged in a hidden trade. One person projects an identity, and the other person reflects it back. You tell a joke. I laugh to show you are funny. You complain about your job. I nod to validate your victimhood. You express an opinion. I agree to show we belong to the same tribe. Jung called this a form of unconscious participation, where the ego seeks confirmation of its existence through the other. We use each other as mirrors. We look into our friends' faces to see a pleasing reflection of ourselves. The empath loner has stopped being a mirror. They have withdrawn their energy from this projection game. When you stand before them, they do not automatically reflect your self-image back to you. They do not laugh if it's not funny. They do not offer sympathy if they sense your suffering is self-inflicted. They do not nod along just to fill the silence. They simply watch. They listen. They remain neutral. This neutrality feels like an attack to a person who is addicted to validation. When you project your identity onto them and they do not catch it, the projection falls to the floor. You are left standing there with your own unresolved energy. You feel exposed. You feel judged, even though they have not spoken a word of judgment. The discomfort you feel is the terror of the void. We rely on the social grease of small talk and fake politeness to cover up the reality of our separation. The empath loner refuses to apply the grease. They let the friction exist. They let the silence stretch out until it becomes heavy. For the average person, this is intolerable. Think about a time you tried to make conversation with someone who just looked at you calmly without helping you carry the conversation. You probably felt a spike of anxiety. You might have tried to provoke a reaction just to break the tension, asking intrusive questions, making dramatic statements, or oversharing. You were trying to hook them back into the game of emotional ping-pong. But the empath does not pick up the paddle. Jung would say that the empath has become a blank screen for the projections of others, because they are not broadcasting a clear signal of "I like you" or "I need you." The other person's unconscious mind starts filling in the blanks. People project their own insecurities onto the silence. If you are insecure about your intelligence, you will perceive the empath's silence as intellectual arrogance. If you are insecure about your social standing, you will perceive their solitude as snobbery. If you are carrying hidden guilt about your own behavior, you will feel that they are silently condemning you. You are not seeing the empath. You are seeing your own shadow reflected in the stillness of their face. This is why they are so often mislabeled. They are called cold, stuck up, distant, or weird. These labels are defenses. It is easier to label the loner as broken than to face the anxiety that their silence provokes in you. The empath loner knows this mechanism intimately. They have seen it happen 100 times. They know that as soon as they stop performing the role of the friendly listener, people turn on them. They know that their lack of need is interpreted as a rejection. And in a way, it is a rejection. It is a rejection of the false self. The empath is silently signaling that they will no longer participate in interactions that are not real. They are not willing to fake a connection just to make you feel comfortable. This honesty is brutal. It strips away the social mask and leaves the interaction raw. Most people cannot handle this rawness. They leave the interaction feeling drained and confused, blaming the empath for bad vibes, when in reality, the empath simply refused to carry their vibes for them. The empath keeps no friends because they are tired of the performance. They know that to keep people around, they would have to start mirroring them again. They would have to pretend to care about trivial dramas. They would have to suppress their own perceptions. They are no longer willing to pay that price. They would rather be unsettled by their own solitude than settled by a lie. In the next part, we will examine the precise moment the rules changed, the crossing of a psychological line that makes the return to the old ways impossible. There is a specific, irreversible point in the psychological development of the empath where the fundamental operating system of their mind changes. This is not a gradual drift, it is a decisive rupture. Before this threshold, the governing principle of their life was connection. After this threshold, the governing principle becomes truth. This shift represents a reversal of the psychic flow. For the vast majority of their existence, the empath's responsiveness was a reflex. It happened faster than conscious thought. If a person in front of them was sad, the empath's physiology mirrored that sadness immediately. If someone was angry, the empath's nervous system registered a threat.